I have been a people person for as long as I can remember. I've always been interested in other people's personal histories and relationship dynamics. As a little girl, I noticed differences between my family system and what I observed in the homes of my friends. I took note of different parenting styles, how siblings interacted, and I marveled at families in which everyone seemed to like each other and have fun. I was aware at a young age that the tensions in the home of my birth seemed unique to my family, and while my parents did their best to express love and care for their children, I was definitely drawn to different models of parental and family harmony that became aspirational. My fascination with relationships between spouses, parents and children, and siblings has never waned. What I've learned through the decades, and especially in my two major roles as clergy and as parent, is that varying levels of historical trauma, and I use the word trauma intentionally, can be passed down from grandparents to parents to children, sometimes with little repercussion and at other times leading to serious complications, including, but not limited to, irreparable rifts. Family ruptures, like all wounds, feel and look huge when the tear, often years in the making, first occurs, but as with all matters, material and emotional, we humans have the capacity to heal and learn to live with the scars on our bodies and in our hearts. It's quite miraculous when you think about it. At this time of year, we engage in the art of teshuvah. This act of return compels us to take meaningful stock of our lives and acknowledge that our time on this planet is but a breath. We are invited to remember and reflect. We remember times when things felt more whole and when they didn't. We're invited to reflect on how we have contributed to our complicated stories, and we all have them, with family, at work, with friends, and evaluate our personal pain points, those events or interactions that cause us to re-experience pain from our past. The goal of teshuvah is not to deny truths about our human condition or pretend that all is well, but to take just a step or two towards compassionate reconciliation with the dissonances in our own lives and in the lives of those that have hurt us. These dissonances are sometimes, not always, byproducts of unidentified inherited trauma, clinically referred to as intergenerational trauma, that results from adverse events or experiences that are passed down from one generation to the next, often in unspoken and deeply complex ways. According to the American Psychological Association, intergenerational trauma is expressed when the descendant of someone who went through one or more traumatic events, physical or psychological in nature, presents challenging emotional and behavioral reactions that are similar to their ancestor or relative. Intergenerational trauma can manifest in multiple ways: through living with a traumatized person who may be reliving horrifying events, or when children become containers for their parents' unwanted or misunderstood pain, or through genetics in utero. There have been many studies in the last 2 decades using laboratory animals that have shown that the offspring of traumatized animals will have the same reaction to negative stimuli, even though they never experienced the negative effect. Trauma can be imprinted genetically and passed on to our children. And if you'd like to learn more, epigeneticist Rachel Yehuda, who's part of the Mount Sinai Medical System in New York, is spearheading some really astounding research in this area. I first heard the term 30 years ago while touring Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, in reference to children of Holocaust survivors, an entire discipline within the field of psychology introduced by Dr. Vivian Rakoff in 1966, became devoted to understanding how living through the Holocaust impacted children and the grandchildren of survivors. It makes total sense. After living through unimaginable horrors perpetrated by the Nazis and their allies, in order to cope, there had to be changes encoded on the survivors' brains and cells that made it possible for them to continue to live. These epigenetic changes and tags on our DNA can account for disruptive, debilitating, and aberrant behaviors. And current science suggests that these kinds of genetic alterations can impact the second and third generations in families. This is helpful for me personally to consider. My beloved mother lived with untreated depression that impacted her in many ways. Most obviously, it manifested in bouts of rage that were not daily, but frequent enough to indelibly impact every one of her children. They were often triggered by matters that seemed trivial. In my lifetime role as self-appointed psychologist, I learned that her father, my sweet grandpa, battled severe depression, which was exacerbated by the Great Depression, when he, a teenage immigrant from Belarus with broken English, lost his entire hard-earned fortune, self-made, during the crash in 1929. Can you imagine? It did not help his mental condition, I'm sure, that the family he sent money to come to America chose to buy a business instead, and all perished in World War II. My dear mother was 1 year old at the start of the Great Depression, her little brain and limbic system still forming. I can only guess that in the late 1920s, the trauma around the world, in this country, and in her household during this critical time in her personal development must have left an indelible mark on her DNA that became the inheritance of her 4 children. While there were great triumphs, many joys and special moments in my family of origin, life in the household of my parents was not always peaceful back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. As adults, we all had very different ways of relating to our mother. She was deeply loved, but the relationships were complicated. What I'm most interested in is what passed on trauma can look like as people age. As clergy, we frequently encounter broken families, siblings who do not speak with one another, children that do not have a relationship with one or more parents, and occasionally, parents who cannot stay in relationship with one or more of their children. Rabbi John Rossov, Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Israel in Hollywood and a respected author and leader in the Reform movement's Zionist arm called Artza, is a regular blogger for the Times of Israel. I was sent his recent blog titled, "Forgiveness is About Letting Go," and the first paragraph resonated with me greatly. He wrote, "Far too often, when I served as a congregational rabbi and was called to officiate at a funeral or meet with the family of the deceased, someone was missing from the inner circle of those close relatives and friends, a brother, a sister, a longtime friend. They were absent not because they were unavailable, but because some serious breach had occurred long before, and the parties never forgave one another or reconciled. All of us will be hurt," he continues, "sometimes deeply by those close to us. Knowing this, our task is to determine how we will cope when we or one of our dear ones is victimized, and what we will have to do to arrive at a place of forgiveness." Rabbi Rossov goes on to share 6 very well-articulated insights into forgiveness that are worth taking to heart. And there are copies of his, I put about 20 copies on the back. Forgiveness is About Letting Go, and something else that he wrote, more entertaining, called Making a Life. And they're on the back table, if you can take them when you leave for your further Rosh Hashanah reading. What I'm suggesting is that later in life manifestations of unaddressed intergenerational trauma may play a role in some of these heartbreaking, often mysterious family divisions. What I often discover when I scratch the surface of family strife is that there can be a critical incident that breaks the camel's back, but that poor camel has been carrying the relationship burdens for years, if not decades. Once the break occurs, those most impacted in hurtful ways may feel the need to make self-protective choices. No two families are going to respond to trauma in the same way. Some units are actually brought closer together, but very often, different characters in the drama will disconnect, detach, distance, abuse, neglect, and in extreme cases, inflict violence. I mentioned earlier that the discipline of intergenerational trauma emerged about 20 years after World War II. Now, while nothing compares to the brutality inflicted on millions of innocents by Nazi perpetrators, there have been few times in Jewish history when communities lived in relative safety and prosperity for more than a century at a time. There were a few pockets of stability and flourishing here and there. In Babylonia, beginning in the 6th century before the Common Era through the Middle Ages, in Spain for several hundred years under Muslim rule, in parts of Western Europe after the Napoleonic Revolution, and of course, right now here in North America. But we don't know what the future holds for us here. In the past, as guests in someone else's country, when things change, Jews were simply slaughtered for no reason, forced to convert upon penalty of death, or forced to flee with only the shirts on their backs. These kinds of frequent episodes would then lead to another 100-year-plus cycle of trauma to be managed. The thing that's easy to forget is that victims in every catastrophic event were people who had children, and they are our ancestors. The passage of trauma from one Jewish generation to another started with Judaism's first family that we read about every Rosh Hashanah: Abraham, Sarah, Lot, Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. The Torah tells us nothing about Abraham, the son of Terah, prior to these words. Go forth from your native land, from the place of your birth, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And then God goes on to make this promise. I'm going to make of you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. The only way that the founder of monotheism was going to realize his potential as a leader was to completely remove himself from all that was familiar, his land, his culture, and his family of origin. Let's consider for a moment how his wife Sarah, also his cousin, might have felt about having to leave her family forever. What about their nephew Lot? Why did he tag along? Was he what we might refer to today as an at-risk child that Uncle Avram knew would benefit from leaving his toxic environment? Or was his presence a way for Abraham to remain connected to the roots he was leaving? Like our first patriarch, many of us find relief when we move away from the land of our birth and our parents' homes. But unless we engage in dedicated work, we bring our unaddressed trauma with us wherever we go. And no resolution often leads to more trouble. Friends in recovery have shared that alcoholics and drug addicts active in disease will sometimes make a decision to relocate geographically and start over again to be free of their addiction, only to find soon enough that they repeat the same patterns wherever they go. It is a time-tested truth that everywhere you go, there you are. Tomorrow we're going to read the story of the binding of Isaac, and the same zeal for God that compelled Avram to leave his home also allowed him to proceed with the near sacrifice of one of his sons at God's command. What was wrong with that guy? This shocking act of devotion changed Isaac forever, and by extension, his sons. Esau and Jacob were destined for trouble even while they were in the womb. And Jacob was riddled with personality flaws, and his 12 sons from 4 different mothers suffered greatly at the hands of poor parenting on many levels. That's in the Torah. Sarah's own disappointments and resentments completely impacted her mothering and her treatment of those around her. At one point, she and Hagar must have been very close, so much so that Sarah entrusted her to be her surrogate. Ishmael was supposed to be Sarah's child too. Did she ever love him? Or was she so angry and frustrated by her personal situation that she could not bond? When her own son was born when she was 90, did he become a container for her unwanted pain? Or why was it that Hagar and Ishmael had to be treated harshly and disappear? Why couldn't they be one happy family? A close reader of the text might intuit, as I have, that Sarah's anguish over leaving her family, being a pawn in many of Abraham's diplomatic interactions, struggles with infertility, and jealous response to Hagar's capacities, combined with Abraham's drive for financial success and myopic devotion to God utterly corrodes their marriage. The obvious victims first appear to be Hagar and Ishmael, who we read about today. Ironically, their story ends quite well. The Torah says explicitly that God was with Ishmael as he grew. He led a simple life as a bowman, he lived in Paran, and his mother found him a wife. And she probably taught that wife how to make some of his favorite recipes. The next time we encounter Ishmael is as an older man when he and Isaac come together to bury their father. Ishmael was able to get over the horrible hurt of being rejected by his family and cast into the wilderness, and he shows up to honor his father upon his death. Ishmael, Esau, and Jacob are three personalities in the Torah who were able to process the trauma of their young lives and face those who wronged them enough that they could come together to mourn their flawed parents. The rest of the Torah, beginning with the book of Exodus, catapults Israelite trauma to a national scale. One would think that the children freed from the slaves would be grateful for their freedom, eager to reach the promised land, but no. The shockingly unappreciative behavior depicted in the book of Numbers after God frees them feeds them daily and performs miracle after miracle in their midst. They had rebellion against Moses and Aaron. They embraced foreign gods. They had hostile fear of the unknown. That was both learned and genetic. They had inherited trauma. And within the next 100 years, the cascade of hideous catastrophes recorded in the book of Judges depicts what can happen when unaddressed trauma passes through multiple generations and afflicts an entire people. Whether one believes that the personalities and tales found in the Tanakh are historical or typological, I for one believe they're typological. They are essential to the ever-unfolding story of the Jewish people that was, is, and never will be a stranger to trauma. The Jewish question is, what can we learn from this picture of pained peoplehood? Number one, even when intergenerational trauma is not addressed at its core, there are things we can do behaviorally to enable real-time relationships to function at the most necessary times, especially surrounding death and honoring parents. Number two, response to trauma is often a catalyst for some of humanity's greatest achievements. It's true. Number three, trauma is part of life, and almost no one escapes some measure of it. Whether we pass it on to the next generation or not is inevitable, and we don't know, but it's inevitable that there will be tyrants, natural disasters, and looming economic insecurity that will make humans continue to pay a price. And that barely scratches the surface of the valuable lessons we can learn. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they say that pain is the touchstone of all personal growth. Sociologists, anthropologists, and historians have marveled at the Jewish people's capacity to endure long after the great civilizations that pummeled us over the millennia have disappeared. I posit, and this is my theory, that the protective changes to our DNA, century after century, are a big part of the reason for our survival. According to Dr. Yehuda, we are not prisoners of our genes, altered or not. We can make changes in response to events, and it is this capacity for transformation that promotes resilience, flexibility, and plasticity. What Schiff refers to, and I love this, these are our weapons of mass construction. Right? I'll say that again, resilience, flexibility, and plasticity. Our job during the high holidays is not to rid ourselves of personal and societal traumas in our lives that impact our closest relationships and sometimes our capacity to function. Our job is to embrace and accept who we are, to accept the trauma that we carry from the generations that preceded us. We're called upon to recognize these honest parts of ourselves and find a way to be inscribed in the book of life for a year that's just a little more peaceful, a little more whole than the year before, a little less angry, a little less resentful, a little less defensive, more honest about our own shortcomings. The work of teshuvah is to help us lighten our loads so there's less of a burden to pass on to the next generation. These small steps can lead to unanticipated healing, greater acceptance, and perhaps the realization that we need another year to productively process our feelings and insights. It's hard work, but it's so worth it. Only God knows if each of us will take our final breath in the coming year. But we control how we live the precious time we have. I began by sharing a little bit about my family of origin, and I want to close by revealing a few insights about my own successes and failures as a parent. During my mother's lifetime, and even after her death, I dug deep to try and understand the source of her depression and her rage. Whether I unearthed truths or not, wrestling with her demons as a way to embrace my own has been very helpful. Admittedly, the learned behaviors of my youth are much more powerful in my intellect. In my more fragile moments, I become my mother, and I have raged at my children more times than I care to admit. It is a scene that most people would not actually believe. And although I hate myself while it's happening and after it's over, it comes as natural to me as my humor, which was also a gift from my mother and my father. It's part of how I'm wired. It's in my DNA. The mild trauma, and it was mild relatively, that my siblings and I experienced in our childhood has not prevented us from doing the right thing when it comes to honoring our dead, but it has had painful ramifications for our adult relationships, and it has been passed on to our children in different ways. The current question that I wrestle with, and only time will tell, is how much of our traumatic legacy will be passed on to our grandchildren's generation. Different than my own mother, I have spoken to my children about my own childhood. I've done my best to offer context when my trauma buttons are pressed, and I've tried to give them healthier coping skills to confront their own demons early in life. But again, only time will tell. I also know that my children are inheriting as adults a world that will force them to confront large-scale global challenges that could set in motion completely different waves of psychological and emotional challenges that may test and change them and their children in unanticipated ways. Right now, there is large-scale trauma on so many levels, the likes of which the world has never seen. The fact that there are millions of nationless people seeking refuge, senseless war, the visible death of Mother Earth, and the ramifications of potential economic insecurity for a shrinking middle class is going to touch everybody world over. These and other crises will find homes in the bodies and the minds of the people who suffer through them, and the impacts are going to ripple through subsequent generations. It is a fact. But Judaism offers a practical antidote, and this is how I end. Jewish practice, if taken seriously, gives us tools and a roadmap to confront our current and inherited pain every year so that we can grow in compassion both for ourselves and those that have hurt us. Saving the world begins with saving ourselves. Saving the world begins with saving ourselves. At the end of Unatana Tokef, which we will chant soon in the Musaf service, we will emphatically proclaim Uteshuva, Utefila, Utsedaka, Ma'avirin et Roa Hagazera. Self-discovery, that's teshuva. Turning to God in prayer, that's tefillah, however you pray. And sharing our material blessings with those in need, that's tzedakah, can mitigate the severity of our decrees. Whoever came up with that three-step program centuries ago was prophetic. They are simple, meaningful actions that cause us to look inward and think outside of ourselves. These are things that stepping outside of ourselves is the first way to realize how we begin to heal. And these are actions that can be done monthly, weekly, daily, and if need be, hourly, to give us purpose and lead to healing. We have been following this Jewish program of recovery for thousands of years, literally through hell and back. And that is why, my friends, that we are still here. So I want to wish all of you in this room a Shana Tova Tikatevu V'Techatemu. May each of us and the generations that we have nurtured be inscribed and sealed for a year of greater wholeness, compassion, and generosity of spirit.